Well, Allan Behm is a long-time thinker on foreign policy, including stints advising Labor ministers in government and in opposition. He's at the Australia Institute these days, and Allan joins us in the studio now. Allan, welcome back. Why don't we start out on Penny Wong's speech, because it really is having international repercussions, generating a discussion, highly conditional about a Palestinian state and recognition of it. But from where we stand today, why would Australia unilaterally and critically ahead of Israel recognise a Palestinian state in the near term?
Greg, good question. There are lots of facets to this. I think last night's speech by Senator Wong was a brilliant speech. It was a really, really good speech because it didn't just talk about Palestine. It talked about where Australia fits in a much broader context. And so you need to see what she was saying around Palestine within the broader context of what she was saying last night. It wasn't a total reset of the government's foreign policy, but it was a re-expression of some parts of it. And it is against that one would have to say that the two-state solution has a long history behind it. The Labor movement in Australia has long supported the creation of a separate Palestinian state. There's nothing new about that. I think what we're seeing at the moment is the government coming to a decision about how do you break the current impasse in which the whole of that problem is situated. An effectively destroyed Palestine, and Israel, which is in pursuit of its own security against the growing sensitivity of the global community that this is not the way to do it.
Right.
So to offer hope about statehood to the Palestinians is, I think, quite an important thing to put out there on the part of the Foreign Minister to try to break the cordon here.
Do we find ourselves in the almost paradoxical position where it might have taken a war, destructive and costly in dollars and lives, to have brought us to a point where this long dormant two-state solution can now be contemplated by international partners? Australia's only one of them, of course. I wouldn't put it that way. I don't think that there is a reasonable strategic argument on Israel's part for the prosecution of this war. It is, to my way of thinking, too disproportional and the destruction too great. I think that for Israel, the ability to accept a state with all of the same rights as Israel has as a state and internationally will still be incredibly hard to swallow. And so there are still many obstacles to the creation of a second state. Nonetheless, what the international community is saying is, if you don't contemplate something like this, your problem remains absolutely unsolvable. Yeah, so is Penny Wong and David Cameron and others, are they, in fact, I've used the word unilateral, are they saying that unilaterally they would recognise a state of Palestine, regardless of Israel's wishes or ambitions to become involved in negotiations?
I think they're putting it out there that if you can't solve this problem, the international community is going to have to solve it for you. So whether it's unilateral or whether it's through the mechanisms of the UN Security Council and the UN, and indeed, a lot of other mechanisms can come into play. I mean, we've had a lot of experience with the creation of new states since the end of the First World War. So I think that there's still a lot of distance to be travelled. I'm not certain at this point that the creation of a two-state solution is really achievable, but when you put it out there as an objective, it clarifies what needs to be done. And I think that is where Senator Wong's speech last night has actually pushed the whole international issue ahead.
Okay.
And it's a very important thing to do.
I understand that. I might get you to come back at this looking through the lens of someone who is familiar with the inner workings of the ALP in this country, not the sort of geopolitical strategic outlook on this. What political forces are at work, or might be, within the ALP at present that might explain why Penny Wong lent into this last night?
Look, I don't think that the Foreign Minister was driven by internal party politics on this. There's always been a bit of roiling going on within the Labor Party about Palestine, as indeed there should be. The Labor Party is a party that thinks a lot about human rights issues, and those pressures are at state conference and at federal conference all the time. I think more to the point, though, is that we live in a world an immediate world, Indonesia being one of the most populous nations, but the most populous Islamic nation in the world, where these things really matter. So we're having to calibrate our foreign policy in the terms of the world in which we actually live and operate. And I suspect that what is driving the government at the moment is looking at this in a much broader sense, where Australia can actually, by taking a small, clearly defined step, help the rest of the global community move forward. And that's why I would applaud it so strongly.
Last one on this. Would that be a novel approach by Australia to be factoring in its Southeast Asian connections and neighbourhood when setting policy on something as fractious, intractable, if you like, to use that word again, as Israel and the Middle East?
I think we've got a good history in that, actually, Greg. I mean, that's exactly what Evatt did in Indonesian independence. I mean, we were straight onto that wagon. I don't think that the Netherlands liked us very much in 1946 when we began that. So Australia's actually got quite a good history in this. We don't trot it out all that often, but when we do, it normally has quite an effect. And that is what we're seeing internationally in response to the Foreign Minister's speech.
Let's see what further discussion that generates. Now, you've also been at the ANU Security Conference yourself, Allan, fulfilling that role as deep thinker that we alluded to in our introduction. You gave your own thoughts about the US alliance, Australia's alliance with the US, that finds wider expression through AUKUS and discussion about Japan joining an element of that. What exactly was your, I think, somewhat provocative outlook on the Australia-US alliance delivered today?
Look, I've spent the last 6 months, Greg, writing a book on this matter, and so I gave it a bit of a trot. And my view is that we make a lot of assumptions about the alliance. There are probably no two countries that are closer in shape and in kind and in the things that drive us than Australia and America. There are differences, of course, but we're very similar historically. Our institutions, our structures, they're all very similar. So what I offered everybody is that, we're worried about the alliance because, we might have a problem with China. Well, I just want to sort of test that a little bit, I said, and say that the thing that would really create an enormous strategic risk for Australia would be the social and political collapse of the United States itself.
Likely?
No.
Donald Trump hangs over that?
Symptomatic, perhaps, but we've got to think about it deeply, though, because if that's the worst possible thing that could happen to us, and I think it is, then we've got to make sure it bloody doesn't. And in order to do that, we've got to engage somewhat differently with the United States. Stop talking so much about the defence relationship, talk much more about those deep institutional structural relationships. So it's not kicking anything out, it's putting a lot more in.
Sounds like a book I might read, and it sounds also like something we might further discuss as we move through this year and towards, in fact, the next presidential elections in the US. Not trying to look at this solely through the Trump lens, but it's irresistible sometimes. Allan Behm, really appreciate it. Thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks for watching. If you like watching our videos or if you learn something new, let us know by leaving a like. And if you share this video on your social media or send it to a friend, that really helps us to get the message out. See you next time.